Your neighbor John is a nice guy, helps with yard work, waves every morning, borrows your hedge trimmer, asks what preparedness brands you buy, friendly, trustworthy. Now run the scenario. Grid fails. 72 hours later, his kids are hungry. The grocery stores are empty. He remembers every conversation about preparedness. He knows you have supplies. He knows you leave every Tuesday for errands. He knows your wife is smaller than him. He knows you have a generator because he heard it last outage. Friendly John is now desperate John with perfect intelligence on your household and a rational incentive to consolidate resources. This isn't paranoia. This is threat modeling. Every disaster, every collapse, every grid-down scenario in history tells the same story. Your neighbors aren't just people who live near you. They're your greatest asset or your most dangerous liability. You need to know which before the lights go out. Here's what every preparedness expert tells you. Know your neighbors. Build mutual aid networks. Establish relationships before the crisis hits. Sound advice. Dangerously incomplete. Because here's what that advice doesn't mention. It was built on an assumption so comfortable and so wrong that it gets people killed. The assumption that collapse is gradual, that you'll have weeks to assess who your neighbors really are as things slowly deteriorate, that trust networks form under pressure the same way they form over barbecues and block parties. They don't. Every piece of data we have on community behavior during sudden infrastructure failure tells the same story. Venezuela 2016. Neighbor-on-neighbor theft documented within 48 hours of widespread food shortages reaching residential neighborhoods. New Orleans 2005. Communities that had been stable for decades fractured within 72 hours of the storm making landfall. Bosnia, early 1990s. Families who had shared streets and schools for generations became informants, and worse, within days of the siege beginning. Not because they were evil, because they were hungry. With hungry children and a rational calculation to make. Proximity plus desperation equals threat. That equation doesn't care about your relationship history. Here's what the community-building doctrine also ignores. The more you integrate with your neighbors before a crisis, the more they know about you. Every preparedness conversation is also an intelligence exchange. Every honest disclosure about your supplies is a target you've painted. You think you're building trust. You're also building a detailed brief on your household that exists in someone else's memory, available on the day they need it most. We went looking at the actual data from every major grid-down scenario on record. What we found wasn't what most preparedness guides want to tell you. The average unprepared household hits desperate behavior within 3 days of supply chain failure. Your unprepared neighbors are a predictable threat, but your prepared neighbors, the ones who've been stocking up and know you have too, they don't hit desperation in 72 hours. They hit a different threshold. The moment they calculate that your 6-month supply plus their 6-month supply equals 12 months for whoever consolidates first. Community is not wrong. The right community, selected carefully and verified under pressure, is one of the most powerful survival assets that exists. The problem is that nobody teaches you how to select it. So we built a framework. Before we show you how to assess your neighbors, we need to give you something more valuable than a list of red flags. Because a list without a framework is just anxiety with bullet points. We're going to teach you the exact methodology. The 3 variables we examined so that you can evaluate any neighbor, anywhere, and know whether they represent an asset or a threat. The neighbor audit. How to grade the people around you. 3 variables determine the calculation. Not their personality, not how long you've lived next to each other, not whether they've always seemed decent. 3 measurable, observable variables that multiply each other's danger when they align. Variable 1. Resource status. Are they prepared or desperate when the grid fails? This is the most visible variable. It's also the most counterintuitive in what it predicts. We'll come back to why. Variable 2. Moral flexibility. Where is this person's breaking point? Behavioral research on scarcity responses shows that populations under genuine resource stress split into predictable thirds. Roughly 10 to 15% turn predatory almost immediately. Roughly 10 to 15% hold their principles regardless of conditions. The remaining 70% land somewhere in the middle, depending on a single factor that has nothing to do with how nice they seem right now. Variable 3. Intelligence on you. What do they already know about your supplies, your schedule, your physical capabilities, your defensive posture? This is the variable most people never consider. It's also the only one you can still actively manage. Here's why these variables don't add together. They multiply. A desperate neighbor with zero intelligence on your household is a random threat. Dangerous, unpredictable, but unfocused. A prepared neighbor with high moral flexibility and detailed knowledge of your situation is not random at all. They're specific. They know the target. They know the access points. They've already run the consolidation math because they're the same kind of person you are. That's not a dystopian fantasy. That's documented behavior from every collapse scenario we've analyzed. So before we reveal which neighbor type poses the highest risk, you need to understand how each variable works. Does your current neighborhood pass what we call the 3-variable threat assessment? Because if it doesn't, you're not living in a community. You're living in a briefing document that someone else will read when they need to. Here's the calculation everyone avoids. The average serious preparedness household maintains somewhere between 3 and 12 months of stored supplies for a family of 2 to 4 people. That's the benchmark. That's what years of deliberate effort, money, and planning buys you. Your 6-month supply plus your neighbor's 6-month supply equals 12 months for one household, or 3 months for 2 households, sharing equally followed by mutual starvation. In a resource-constrained environment, consolidation beats cooperation every time. This isn't a moral argument. It's arithmetic, and your prepared neighbor can do arithmetic. We call this the prepared neighbor paradox, and every collapse dataset we've examined confirms it plays out the same way. Bosnia, early 1990s. Research conducted during and after the siege period found that households with meaningful stored resources did not band together and pool supplies. They fortified individually. 2 prepared families on the same block were not natural allies. They were rational competitors. Each one was calculating whether the other represented a threat to be neutralized or an opportunity to be exploited. Pre-war friendships held until the food pressure became acute. Then they didn't. Venezuela documented the same pattern with disturbing specificity. Neighbors who had been genuinely friendly for years began conducting systematic passive surveillance of each other's households within weeks of widespread shortages reaching residential areas. Lights on at unusual hours. Children who didn't look as hungry as everyone else's. Stress levels that seemed inconsistent with the neighborhood average. These were reconnaissance behaviors. In a significant percentage of documented cases, they preceded hostile action. The uncomfortable implication is this: being a visible, prepared household is not neutral. It is a declaration. The deliveries, the conversations, the generator hum during the last outage, the people in observation range of your daily life have already assembled an intelligence picture that you didn't authorize and cannot delete. Your unprepared neighbors are a predictable threat. Desperate, visible, operating on pure instinct. Manageable. Your prepared neighbor is the strategic threat. Calm. Patient. Running the same math you just ran. Distance from major population centers matters. Geography matters. But none of it protects you from the person 2 doors down who already knows what you have. Resource status is the most visible variable. It is not the most dangerous one. Not everyone breaks at the same rate. This is the most important sentence in this entire analysis, and it's the one that conventional preparedness thinking gets most catastrophically wrong. Here's the distribution. Every major collapse study we've reviewed documents roughly the same population split. Approximately 10 to 15% of any community turns predatory within hours of serious disruption. These are people with pre-existing impulse control problems, histories of opportunistic behavior, or a genuine indifference to social consequences. They don't need starvation. They need permission. Chaos is permission. At the other end of the curve, roughly 10 to 15% maintain principled behavior regardless of conditions. They have structural anchors deep enough to hold under maximum pressure. Religious frameworks, tight family accountability, or a history of navigating genuine hardship that stress-tested and verified their own character. That leaves 70 to 80% in the middle. And the middle includes most of your neighbors. Here's what determines where someone in that middle group lands. Not personality, not likability, not years of neighborly goodwill. One factor, whether they have ever been genuinely tested. Real scarcity, real deprivation. Hardship that required sustained sacrifice with no guaranteed outcome and no rescue in sight. Middle-class comfort is not moral training. It is moral anesthesia. Behavioral research on this is uncomfortable reading. Studies on self-predicted behavior under resource scarcity consistently find that people who have never experienced genuine deprivation are the least accurate predictors of their own conduct when it arrives. They believe they know their floor. They don't. The floor is only revealed by the fall. Venezuela documented this with painful precision. Neighbors described by their communities for years as generous, dependable, and kind became informants and worse as the crisis deepened. Not on day one, on a timeline that, in hindsight, tracked their prior stress response patterns almost exactly. How they handled minor financial setbacks, how they responded to property disputes, whether they followed inconvenient rules when no one was watching. Small tests are data. They tell you where the floor is before the catastrophic test arrives. Your neighbor who loses composure in traffic, who takes shortcuts on shared responsibilities, who bends minor rules when the cost is low. That's not a character quirk. That's a floor reading. Score your moral flexibility assessments before you need them. Once the grid fails, the assessment window closes. Your biggest vulnerability isn't your supply level. It's the intelligence picture your neighbors have already assembled about you without ever asking. So we ran the audit. What does the average household in a residential neighborhood already know about its prepared neighbor? They know the schedule. When vehicles are present and when they're not. When lights go on at 6 a.m. When there's unusual activity at unusual hours. They know family composition. How many people, approximate ages, approximate physical capabilities. They know the vehicles, which communicates economic profile and resupply timing. They know about the generator because they heard it during the last outage. They know about the preparedness orientation because deliveries are visible, conversations happen, and people pay more attention to their neighbors than their neighbors realize. The average household shares more operational intelligence with its immediate neighbors through ordinary daily existence than most people would deliberately choose to share. You didn't brief them. You didn't need to. Proximity is a passive surveillance system that never turns off. This is the third variable, and it is the only one where you still have meaningful control. The principle is information asymmetry. Your security margin is directly proportional to how much more you know about the threat landscape around you than those within it know about you. Every piece of intelligence they hold about your household narrows that margin. Every piece you hold about theirs widens it. The prepared community trap is where most serious preppers damage themselves most severely. Neighborhood preparedness groups, online forums, skill-sharing meetups. Every one of these exchanges is a bilateral intelligence operation dressed as cooperation. You learn their capability level. They learn yours. Pre-crisis, that feels like trust building. Post-crisis, every detail you shared becomes an input in the threat calculation of someone who is now desperate and remembers everything. Damage control runs on 3 tactics. Compartmentalization. Different neighbors hold different fragments. None hold a complete picture. Misdirection. Your visible behavior suggests lower preparedness or a bug-out plan rather than shelter in place. Defensive uncertainty. They're unsure of your actual capabilities, which creates deterrence without confirmation. You cannot erase what they already know, but you can stop adding to it starting today. 3 variables. We've measured all of them. Now let's put them together into something you can actually use. 5 neighbor types, ranked by threat level. This isn't a personality judgment, it's triage. Type 1. Unprepared, low moral flexibility indicators, high intelligence on you. Visible financial stress. History of impulsive behavior. Has asked direct questions about your supplies or made jokes that weren't jokes about knowing where to go when things get bad. In Katrina's aftermath, this profile was responsible for the majority of targeted residential theft within the first 96 hours. This neighbor has already identified you as a resource node. They're waiting for conditions that lower the cost of acting on that assessment. Information blackout immediately. Physical hardening now. Plan for hostile contact. Threat score, maximum. Type 2. Prepared, moral flexibility unknown. Mutual preparedness intelligence shared. The fellow prepper 2 doors down. Rational actor running the same consolidation math you just learned. In Bosnia, 2 prepared households on the same block were more likely to be in competition than cooperation by week 3. Compartmentalized disclosure only. Never reveal full capacity. Threat score, high and strategic. Type 3. Unprepared. Principles unknown, low intelligence on you. They'll be desperate but unfocused. Your defense here is invisibility. Maintain information asymmetry. Don't become the visible target when they start looking. Threat score, moderate and manageable. Type 4. Prepared, demonstrated principled behavior under prior stress. Verified trust built incrementally over time. This neighbor exists. They're rare. If you've identified one, invest in that relationship now with small reliability tests before you need to rely on them for anything serious. Cautious alliance with nothing fully exposed. Threat score, low, with ongoing verification required. Type 5. Mutual invisibility. They don't know your status. You don't know theirs. Maintain this state. It is a form of security most people don't recognize as such. Threat score, neutral. Preserve it. You've got the typology. Now let's talk about what actually works. Let's pause here. I know what some of you are thinking. Why not just organize the neighborhood? Why not form a mutual defense coalition and solve the problem collectively? Fair question. Let's address it directly. A neighborhood defense pact is not a survival strategy. A neighborhood defense pact is a delayed conflict with a shared perimeter. The data on this is not ambiguous. Every documented mutual aid coalition formed under genuine resource scarcity eventually fractured. The fracture point was always the same. The moment collective survival required one member to sacrifice meaningfully more than another. That moment always arrived. In post-Katrina research, informal neighborhood coalitions began showing internal stress indicators within 5 to 7 days. A coalition of desperate people with competing resource interests and no external enforcement mechanism is not a defense force. It's an internal threat wearing a cooperative face. So here's what does work. For your Type 1 neighbor, the entire strategy is disappearance. Gray man posture during the crisis. No visible generator use, no visible food preparation, no patterns that confirm you're functioning while they're not. They should not be certain you're still there, let alone still stocked. For your Type 2 neighbor, deterrence through uncertainty. They should believe you're capable of defending your household without knowing the specifics of that capability. An unknown risk calculates as a high risk. For your Type 3 neighbor, maintain invisibility and avoid becoming the obvious low-resistance target when they start looking for one. For your Type 4 neighbor, incremental investment now. Small tests of reliability under low-stakes conditions. Gradual, compartmentalized disclosure. Trust is a probability, not a guarantee. A location gives you a chance. Skills give you options. The right community gives you a future. The wrong community accelerates the timeline of exactly the scenario you were trying to avoid. Here's the truth nobody says out loud. There is no complete security from the people who live 50 feet away. Proximity is a permanent variable. You cannot relocate them. You cannot guarantee their behavior. The walls you build buy time. They don't buy certainty. What you can change is the probability. The math shifts in your favor when they don't know what you have. When their risk calculation on your household comes back unfavorable, when you've made yourself a worse target than whatever easier option exists elsewhere, you can't eliminate the threat. You can make yourself the wrong choice. Here's the protocol. First, audit your current intelligence exposure. What do your nearest neighbors already know? Deliveries, conversations, generator patterns, schedule rhythms. Accept what can't be undone. Stop adding to it today. Second, classify your neighbors now using the 3 variables: resource status, moral flexibility indicators, intelligence on you. Assign each a threat tier honestly. Third, adjust your information behavior per tier. Maximum compartmentalization with all yellow and red flags. Cautious incremental trust only with verified green flags. Fourth, harden physical security quietly, with no signals that confirm your status to anyone observing from the street. Fifth, accept the residual risk. Some scenarios involving a determined, prepared, strategically minded neighbor cannot be fully defended against. You can only raise the cost high enough that they calculate a better option elsewhere. All of this has to happen before the grid fails. After, the assessment window closes. You're operating on incomplete information under maximum pressure with no time to course correct. The people who survive position themselves before the crisis. They know their neighbors the way a security analyst knows a threat landscape. Completely. Honestly. Without sentiment getting in the way of the math. 3 variables. 5 neighbor types. 1 window to act.